Hey everyone, this is Gabby
and Karim,
and you're listening to the Making of an Incredible MD podcast by Allied to Health.
Tune in each week to hear us talk about the journey of getting into med school.
From GAMSAT to medical interviews, get the insider scoop from med students who have done it all before. So stay tuned and get ready to get med ready.
Hey guys, welcome back. So this is part 2 of our interview with Tommy Moore, talking about psychedelic medicines and treatment of PTSD and depression. It's been a really interesting interview so far, and we're just about to start talking on how psychedelics actually work in the brain and what their mechanisms of action are.
Let's start with psilocybin. Psilocybin, the three main therapeutic mechanisms in terms of the biological basis, the biological mechanisms of this are neuroplasticity, functional connectivity, and modulation of the default mode network. So I'll go into each of these and explain the science as deep as you would like to go, but I love science and love talking about this. We'll start with neuroplasticity. Again, neuroplasticity is something that is like bounced around quite a lot, especially in, people who are, really trying to progress or learn faster or do things better or things like that. So they're looking at nootropics, then, microdosing is coming into the equation. Like, if it has neuroplastic mechanism, then should we use it for other things? Should we microdose it? Should we do this? Should we do that? Neuroplasticity is, by definition, the ability for our brain to adapt to experience. Now, one thing that has been going around is that psychedelics can induce neurogenesis. This is false. We cannot create new neurons, but we can change the connections between those neurons, which is what neuroplasticity is about. So it's not about growing your brain. It's about being able to adapt to the connections. And I'll explain as we go through these therapeutic mechanisms why that makes sense. So neuroplasticity, the ability for our brain to adapt to experience. So all the way up to age about 25, our brain is very, very plastic. So our brain can adapt to pretty much any sensory experience. And you don't really need to be paying all that much attention. When you're younger, you can just hear something in the background and you can learn from it. But neuroplasticity, because our brain and nervous system innervates every organ and part of our body, neuroplasticity is not just about the brain, it's about our entire body. So, you can be neuroplastic or activate neuroplasticity when you're learning a new skill. Like it could be a motor learning thing. So, but after age 25, it becomes a little bit more difficult. But one thing is definitely certain is that neuroplasticity can be accessed across the lifespan, but it's a little bit more rigid after age 25. Or thereabouts, when our brain is quote unquote fully developed. But what we do know is that our brain can adapt. But how it adapts depends on what chemical concoction is available to us. So there's three things that are required for our brain to be able to adapt. They are epinephrine, dopamine, and acetylcholine. So epinephrine often is referred to as like this stress molecule or the stress neurotransmitter or neuromodulator. So epinephrine, the word itself, epi being above or just outside of, and nephron, you think of nephron, you think of kidneys. So it's because it's secreted from the adrenals, which is very close to the kidneys.
So stress hormones released by the sympathetic nervous system, right?
Correct. And one thing that is important to know actually is stress is a generic system in our body. It's like you can obviously have higher and lower levels of stress, but across our body, we have this thing down our spine called the sympathetic chain ganglia. You may have known that through medical studies. So when we increase our level of stress, that means we're more alert, we're more focused. But again, if you have too high stress, then rapid heart rate, you feel anxious. There's obviously a level of arousal that's optimal for learning. So you don't want to be too alert, but you don't want to be not alert enough. So epinephrine is really about alertness and attention. And we really need high amounts of alertness for our brain to be able to adapt after it's quote unquote fully developed. So epinephrine is one, dopamine is another. Dopamine's obviously commonly thought of as like a pleasure hormone or a pleasure neurotransmitter, should I say. But it's really about motivation and drive. Dopamine is, depending on where it's the brain or the body, like something like Parkinson's disease, you have a lack of dopamine, so you struggle to contract or initiate contraction within the muscle. But in the brain, it's about motivation and drive. And so if you so dopamine's the precursor to epinephrine. So if you want more epinephrine, it has to go through the dopamine pathway. And so what we need with dopamine is that our brain needs to have a reason to want to change. So the motivation behind why it is going to adapt to a certain situation. And so
Dopamine's released as a reward, right? Like if you do something, your brain goes, oh, I like the thing you just did, I'm going to release dopamine. So it's kind of like creating habits, so to speak. It's really like the habit hormone.
Yeah, in many ways it is. And having high amounts of dopamine you will feel more pleasure. That's very, very clear. A lot of things like heroin just ramp up dopamine so high that it's just so incredibly pleasurable, but obviously that plummets and changes the way our brain works, and that people can become addicted to it because that's the only way they find pleasure after that. So yeah, dopamine is more about motivation and drive than it is about pleasure, because we need an initial spike of dopamine to actually bias us towards doing things. And so interestingly, there's this thing called the dopamine reward prediction error. So I'll give you an analogy of that. I mean, we are getting slightly off track, but I told you I like science, and I'm sure everyone does like science, and these are all useful things to know. So the dopamine reward prediction error. So let's say, Karim, like there's this really, really cool cafe that you have to go to. I've tried their burger and it is amazing. Like, let's go. We have to go, right? So you're going to have you're feeling kind of motivated to go. You've got an initial dopamine spike. And so, but there's also like an anticipatory kind of mechanism behind it where you're expecting it to be a certain level. And so what can happen is if your expectation doesn't meet your reality, you're not going to get that second burst of dopamine that is giving you that pleasure, which is really interesting because, there's so many people who expect so much of certain things, and then when it doesn't meet quite their expectations, they're not going to get that secondary release of dopamine for the pleasure aspect of it or the reward aspect of it. So that's really interesting.
I think I remember reading about this with slot machines. So people who are addicted to gambling, their highest levels of dopamine actually occur before they turn on the slot machines and before they get the result, because it's the excitement that sort of causes that dopamine spike, I suppose. Is that essentially what that is?
Yeah. I mean, pretty much exactly what that is. But again, I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't know the whole thing about it, but I do know that it is definitely involved in motivation and drive, and you need to have a little bit of dopamine to have the motivation to do things. So we have epinephrine, we have dopamine. The other one is acetylcholine. So acetylcholine, again, has different functions, whether it's in the muscle or whether it's in the brain. In the muscle, it's obviously to do with contraction or nerve impulses and allowing the sodium-potassium pump to work and nerve signals to function normally. But acetylcholine, in terms of the brain, has a lot to do with focus and alertness, but in a different way. And so what acetylcholine also does is, so if you're focusing on my voice right now, so you've got your auditory system is lighting up and you're integrating this sound and making sense of the sound. And so what acetylcholine will be doing right now is actually flagging that particular neural circuit. So it's putting a marker on that. So if you've got epinephrine, you've got dopamine, you're focused, you're listening, you're paying attention, you're being flagged in that particular neural circuit in your auditory system or whatever it's integrating into as well. Could be the hippocampus or other memory related things as well. But that's essentially being marked for growth. And so the way that that adapts then is that when we're in our first phase of sleep, or even in non-sleep deep rest, something like a yoga nidra, when we're in deep relaxation, this is when the nerve growth factors actually get recruited, and that's when our brain will adapt. So we have like a marker for the change, and then for that to be fully developed into an actual neural circuit, and I guess have understanding or knowledge, is after those growth factors have been released.
Right.
So I thought
Psilocybin, I'm guessing, modulates all those.
So psilocybin is thought to be neuroplastic through the AMPA glutamate. So it's through glutamate to be neuroplastic. That's the thought mechanism behind it. And they have shown that your brain can adapt, and it can adapt even more well through a psilocybin experience. But I thought I'd give that background, because a lot of people are jumping on board way too quickly and thinking like, oh, I'll take psilocybin, microdose, and my brain's just going to grow in perfect ways. But neuroplasticity can be good or it can be bad. You know, if you have a traumatic experience, during that experience, super high levels of stress, super high levels of epinephrine, you're going to be focused, you're going to flag that. And so that's why it can be really difficult to reverse certain aspects that we've adapted to. So things like trauma. So what they've found is that our brain can adapt, and it can adapt incredibly well, especially if we're ingesting psilocybin. But again, that comes back to the setting that I mentioned earlier. What's the intention for using the substance? What are you actually trying to fix? Where are you going with this? So if there isn't a clear intention, your brain's not just going to adapt for whatever reason. It's not just going to cure all your things. It's not a panacea. But that is one of the therapeutic mechanisms. And when we think of our brain and think of our thought patterns, and if we're associating thought patterns with particular neural circuits within our brain, and mental illness existing as like a rigid thought pattern, it's like we're stuck in that loop. We're stuck in that particular place where we can't, it feels like we can't get out of it. And we all experience this in some degree or another when we're stuck in that rumination. We're stuck in that rigid thinking where we can't seem to get out of it. You have this negative bias towards yourself or towards life that is really, really hard to get out of. And so the more we think about that, the more it's reinforced. So it's even harder to reverse that back. So we need neuroplasticity if we want to change the way we perceive the world. So neuroplasticity is one. The other one is functional connectivity. So functional connectivity has to do with different parts of the brain communicating with each other that wouldn't usually communicate. So a lot of reports say that you have this synesthesia, like a merging of senses where you're like seeing sounds or hearing colors or things like that. And what we're finding through fMRI scans, and I will tell all the listeners to look up Imperial College London. They've done some incredible work in the neuroimaging side of things. So a lot of these therapeutic mechanisms in terms of like what's happening to the level of the brain come from that, and the work of Robin Carhart-Harris and David Nutt. Done incredible work in that space. So what they found through fMRI scans is that more of the brain is actually communicating with each other. And if you compare a control group to a psychedelic group, you'll find that the same number of connections are happening, but in the psychedelic group, connections are happening to different areas of the brain. So you might have the prefrontal cortex communicating to the hippocampus or the parietal lobe or whatever it might be. So this starts to make sense because, again, coming back to psychedelic, mind revealing, you're actually having access to more parts of your mind, and you can understand what's happening inside of your brain so much more clearly and vividly through these experiences. And so that can be really, really helpful for patients who may not understand why they're feeling certain ways. So this will allow them to help understand where that mental illness is coming from within themselves.
So it's sort of like you've got a gate between these sort of areas in the brain usually, and psilocybin helps open that gate, would you say?
Yeah. So Aldous Huxley, who was famously wrote The Doors of Perception. So he had a mescaline experience, which is a classical psychedelic, and he had originally proposed that our brain is a reducing valve of reality, and so what we're actually experiencing is filtered reality, right? So, I mean, anytime you look into the neuroscience literature, you'll find all these different tricks, like the blind spots and all these things that we don't usually know about, and that's helpful, because if we were integrating every single sensation, it would just be overwhelming and it would just be messy. So what our brain does, for example, like right now, I'm looking at you through the screen, and I'm integrating that. It's going into my eyes, and then it's going into part of my brain, but then I'm also like filtering out pretty much everything else. I'm like hyper focused on that particular thing, and so it's kind of guessing the rest of it. But through a psychedelic experience, what can, these vivid hallucinations is what people kind of report. You're seeing extreme vivid colors, like green is so green, and this blue is so blue, and this red is so red, and so these hallucinations kind of can, in some ways, unfilter some parts of reality. And so, I mean, the visual system being an example, and the easiest one to probably explain. So functional connectivity is that second therapeutic mechanism. The third is modulation of the default mode network. Now, this is the most interesting one, because this is how it relates to spiritual experiences and this loss of self, or this ego dissolution that so many people are reporting. So the default mode network is a network in the brain. So it's a couple of different regions in the brain, includes anterior cingulate cortex, the parietal lobe, and a few other areas of the brain. And what the default mode network is or does, or when it lights up or when it's active, is when we're not really involved in any external task. We're not recording a podcast, we're not focusing on anything in particular. And this is where a lot of birth of mental illness comes, is when, you're kind of in between tasks, you're not really doing much, and then you'll come back to this default state. So you're not directing, you don't have any, what you'd say, top-down processing. You're not having any intention with anything that you're doing. And this is when these thoughts kind of come up without, or it feels like they come up without your control, because you're reverting back to this default state. And so for some, this is fine. We all have this default state, and we might be ruminating on, what am I going to do this afternoon, or what's for dinner, or this or that, or it could be anything. But for some people, it's negative bias. And so when we're reverting back every time we're in this default state, coming back to these rigid patterns that are hidden there and come to fruition when we are not involved in any external task. And this is kind of as close as we can say the birth of rumination can take place. Again, as far as we can say that in terms of neuroimaging. Now, this default mode network is what is theorized to be what is constructing the sense of self. So it's got parts of the visual and auditory system within the default mode network. And so we build up this perception of ourselves all the way from birth up to where we are now. So when we're born, there's no real sense of self. It's just like this big blob of sensation. And so as we develop into our childhood and say Karim, and so you're associating that word with you, and then you start putting all these associations together and start constructing this sense of self. It's like, oh, I'm this human, I'm separate to everything else. Okay, and so there's this feeling of separateness. And the reason why there's visual and auditory involved in this is because, if I'm looking at the wall over there, I'm not thinking this is self, I'm saying not self. And so a lot of the visual and auditory system is involved in feelings of not self. But when you modulate that, so when there is a blood redistribution away from the default mode network, or when the default mode network is very, very quiet, what you'll feel is actually a feeling of connection. You feel that everything that you experience is you. And so I always say, like, you are, the sensations of yourself is just as important as the sensation that of which is beyond yourself. Whatever you perceive is you, And so by modulating this this default mode network and what constructs our ego, then what we can find is that having that ego death kind of puts us in the position of, you know, I'm so much more than this human body. Like, I am this awareness. I am this consciousness that is so much more than just this human body. And, you know, there can be discussion about, like, you know, does the brain generate consciousness, or where is that? Of course, this is science that hasn't been necessarily discovered, but psychedelics are certainly leading towards consciousness research and understanding, well, what is consciousness? What is this all about? So really interestingly, actually, there was a study done in Johns Hopkins where they compared, and Imperial College London too, they compared long-term meditators to a control to a psychedelic experience. So they looked at the neuroimaging, and what they found with long-term meditators is that they also had lower activity in the default mode network. So feelings of loss of self. And so there's like this emergence of sensations, and you're calling your entire field of consciousness yourself rather than just the bodily sensations, or like interoception versus exteroception. And so what they found through the psychedelic experience is that this same network was being diminished or destroyed. Well, not destroyed, but like quietened. And so there's been a lot of really cool studies and research into comparing the meditative state versus the psychedelic state, because there's so many similarities in terms of, you know, feeling connected and feeling that oneness, that you're connected to everyone and everything. And what I was saying before about feeling disconnected from other people and all these things. And so to reignite that feeling of connection and that you are part of this greater, vast cosmic consciousness that we're all sharing, is obviously incredibly profound, and it makes sense why people are finding this experience as to be one of their top 5 most meaningful experiences of their life.
And quite spiritual, I suppose. And that's where that spirituality idea comes from the use of these substances.
For sure, and it's not addressed in the mental health or mental illness space. We think of mental health as separate than spiritual health.
Yeah.
But anytime you kind of,
you know, like with mental health, you sort of talk about the default mode network, and the idea that, like, if you have a negative view of yourself, and that default mode network is just like reinforcing that view over and over again, you can sort of see how, like, creating that separation from thinking about yourself during these experiences might be the therapeutic method. Yeah, so it almost sort of makes sense.
Yeah, and there's a number of theories that have been put forward to account for the therapeutic effects of psychedelics, but the most prominent theories are based on the recent brain imaging data. But again, we can't, like I said before, what we don't know far exceeds what we do know, but there's so much research that needs to be done. And what we're asking for is a rescheduling of these medicines so that more research can be done, like public funding from the government. And what we're seeing in Australia actually is only yesterday there was a new institute called the Psyche Institute, and they got $40 million from a North American biotechnology company. And so part of the research funding from the Australian government, which was $15 million into psychedelic research, which is the biggest of its kind in the world in this modern era. So incredible. Australia may well be one of the first to widely accept these medicines, which is really, really exciting to be a part of.
And it's super important as well. I mean, I think when you think about these trials, all trials for all medicines start small. We always start off with small trials, and we just build and build and build because we get positive results down the ladder. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking this stuff is not right, it doesn't work, it's probably not correct, you know, a lot of medicine started off like this. In fact, I'd argue that almost all medicine started off like this. Small trials showed some work, we took it to the population, showed more work, it was highly efficacious, so it becomes a public sort of drug that becomes prescribed. So yeah, I think that those results are really, really positive.
Yeah, and I mean, one way in which classical psychedelics, so when I say classical psychedelics, I should say that these are things like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, DMT, ayahuasca, which uses DMT in the ceremony, peyote. those are all very similar in their therapeutic effects of what I've just described. But then there's non-classical psychedelics like MDMA, which work slightly differently. And I'll get to those in a sec. But one way in which classical psychedelics may help with issues like depressive or addictive and obsessive disorders is by allowing the brain and mind to break out of repetitive and rigid styles of thinking. So when we talk about neuroplasticity and functional connectivity, if you imagine this brain becoming so plastic and then having the intention of understanding where those thought patterns are coming from, finding out where they're coming from, and then remolding your brain because of this neuroplasticity that you can access, you can actually train or retrain the way you're thinking or your perception towards all of these things. So yeah, can break out of these rigid styles of thinking, feeling, or behaving. So, I mean, recent research is looking into what exactly. So psilocybin, when ingested, gets converted into psilocin. Psilocin then acts on the 5-HT2A receptor, which is one of 14 subtypes of serotonin receptors in our brain. But this 5-HT2A receptor is what aids adaptivity through enhancing sensitivity to context, learning and unlearning, cognitive flexibility, and synaptogenesis, which is new neural connections and how that kind of works. So in a therapeutic setting, which is what we're looking at, psychedelics frequently produce profound personal or existential insights, feelings of empathy, feelings of self-compassion, sense of connection and unity with other people, things, and the world in general, and the universe as a wider context. And research shows that these characteristics are correlated to the therapeutic outcomes, and that patients regard these experiences among their most meaningful ones.
Yeah, well, Tommy, that was such an incredible conversation, and I'd love to keep talking to you about this all day. But unfortunately, we're running out of time for this particular episode, so I wanted to leave our audience with one final question. I know you can keep talking about it, but just one final question for our audience. As future healthcare professionals, how can we implement some of this learning into our future careers, and how can we continue to learn about alternative medicine rather than just regarding them as something on the side or something that's not to be incorporated into mainstream medicine, so to speak?
I think a big thing is not just looking at clinical evidence, because like I was saying before, the way clinical evidence or clinical science works is that you have something like psilocybin. It's like, all right, how can we use that to treat one particular thing? And so again, this can be very, very helpful and has shown to be incredibly helpful. But I think we need to widen our scope a little bit and look at the research that's been done over millennia. I mean, I don't necessarily call it research, but something like looking into the materia medica, which was like herbal and medicinal mushroom remedies that's based on traditional Chinese philosophy. And so a lot of these medicines have incredible merit, but they didn't necessarily know what biochemicals were. What they called spirit, we may now call a biochemical. So their efficacy is lagging in the Western sense, because we need to find out, well, what receptors do they attach to? How does that affect the brain? How does that affect the body? But again, like there's so much merit in so many different herbs and medicines. So I think just looking, obviously science is an incredible tool. It's amazing, and we can thank science for saving so many lives. But science isn't the be all and end all with everything. And I think expanding your view on things may involve looking outside of science. Obviously, you can't make scientific claims based on that. So you can't say, all right, ginkgo biloba grows your brain, something like that. But having psychological phenomena, which is what all of these ancient medicinal texts refer to, because they certainly didn't have brain imaging or body imaging technology to be able to distinguish what does what, but they did know through hundreds, thousands of years of evidence that certain things work in certain contexts. yeah, if I think just research is great, and expanding and looking at a study and critiquing it, looking at how the study was conducted, and this goes across all things. We need obviously weight of evidence for things to be implemented into Western medicine, but there are so many that are yet to emerge because we don't have a biological basis for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think keeping that open mind is super important, just in all areas of medicine, not just in alternative medicine. Thanks so much for joining us today, Tommy. It's been an absolute pleasure to have a chat to you.
Blew everyone's ears away. It's been talking nonstop. Have we really been recording?
I think we've been recording for quite a while.
20. Yeah, right. That did go very quick. But yeah, we'll have to talk about MDMA because I think MDMA is also heavily stigmatized. So we'll have to sit down again to talk about that.
Absolutely. I'm very excited to potentially have a part 2. So hopefully we'll be welcoming you back shortly. But thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciated it and appreciated hearing your points of view. For our listeners, if you want to check out some of Tommy's other work, you can have a listen to the Mind Medicine Australia podcast, as well as the Mind Body Plants podcast. Where can they find those, Tommy? Just Spotify?
Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, they're all on there.
Beautiful.
I think Deezer, Stitcher, a couple of other ones. Yeah, if you just search Mind Medicine Australia, I think most people use Spotify, or at least I tend to think that most people use Spotify because I do. But yeah, if you search up Mind Body Plants or Mind Medicine Australia, it should come up.
Wonderful. And thank you for our listeners for listening to another episode of The Making of an Incredible MD. It's always a pleasure having these guests on. It's a real pleasure for myself as well. It's really the only reason I have these sort of episodes, because I just want to learn more. But thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Making of an Incredible MD podcast by Allied to Health. Please like, share, and subscribe to help spread the word about our podcast. And we'd love to hear your feedback. So send us an email or message on Facebook. All of our links are in the show notes. Thanks. We'll see you next time.